I think you should be with your mother tonight. Those were the words that made Ethan Callaway forget he was one of the most powerful CEOs in Chicago. The words that made him stop reaching for his water glass halfway through a sentence. The words spoken by a woman he had known for exactly 7 minutes. Grace Bennett stood from her chair and offered a small apologetic smile. The soft lighting of the restaurant reflected against the windows overlooking the river, while conversations and clinking glasses filled the air around them. Yet somehow, everything seemed to fade into silence. Ethan stared at her. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. Grace hesitated, as though she wasn't sure she should have spoken at all. "I'm sorry," she said. "That wasn't my place." Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. He wasn't easily surprised. At 39, he had negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions, survived hostile board takeovers, and spent years reading people before they even opened their mouths. But this woman sitting across from him had somehow seen something nobody else had noticed. Something he had spent months pretending didn't exist. Grace reached for her purse. "Thank you for dinner," she said gently. "I should go." Ethan looked at her, genuinely confused. Usually blind dates lasted longer than 7 minutes. Usually women asked questions about his company, his penthouse, his travel schedule, or the luxury properties that appeared in magazines every year. Usually they were curious about Ethan Callaway the billionaire. Grace Bennett hadn't asked about any of those things. Instead, she had spent most of the conversation studying him with quiet concern, as if she were trying to understand something deeper than his title. "You're leaving already?" Ethan asked. She nodded. "I think so. Did I say something wrong?" A faint smile touched her lips. "No, then why?" Grace glanced toward the floor before meeting his eyes again. There was kindness there. Not pity. Not admiration. Just kindness. The kind Ethan hadn't encountered in a very long time. "Because you're not really here," she said softly. The words landed harder than they should have. Ethan leaned back. "Slightly. I'm sitting right here." "Physically," Grace replied. "But not mentally." She wasn't wrong. Since arriving at the restaurant 20 minutes earlier, Ethan had checked his phone 6 times. 3 missed messages from Mercy Memorial Hospital. 2 updates from his mother's nurse. 1 voicemail he still hadn't listened to. He had hidden his concern behind practiced smiles and polite conversation, but apparently not well enough. Grace picked up her coat. "My father spent his last 6 months waiting for everyone else to finish being busy," she said. "I promised myself I'd never let someone I care about do the same." Ethan swallowed. Around them, waiters moved between tables carrying plates and glasses. A jazz pianist played softly near the entrance. The city lights shimmered beyond the windows. Yet all Ethan could hear was the memory of his mother's voice from earlier that afternoon. "Go to the date, sweetheart. Stop worrying about me for one evening." She had laughed when she said it, but the laugh had sounded weaker than usual. "How did you know?" Ethan finally asked. Grace gave a small shrug. "You kept looking at your phone every few minutes." "That doesn't mean anything." "Maybe not." She paused. "But every time you looked at it, you stopped smiling." Ethan looked away. He wasn't used to people noticing details like that. Most people only noticed the tailored suit, the expensive watch, or the fact that his company employed over 12,000 people nationwide. Grace had noticed something else entirely. Something human. She stepped away from the table. "I hope your mother is okay," she said. Then she turned toward the exit. Ethan watched her walk away through the restaurant. No dramatic goodbye. No request for another date. No attempt to impress him. She simply left. And for reasons he couldn't explain, he found himself staring after her long after she disappeared through the glass doors. Because for the first time in years, someone hadn't looked at Ethan Callaway and seen a billionaire. They had looked at him and seen a son. 24 hours earlier, the steady hum of traffic drifted through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Ethan Callaway's office on the 52nd floor of Callaway Tower. Below him, downtown Chicago glowed beneath a gray February sky, but Ethan barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on the message sitting unanswered on his phone. The screen displayed the name that mattered more than every contract, shareholder report, and acquisition proposal spread across his desk. "Mom." He had read her message 3 times already. "Please do not cancel tonight. Go to the dinner." "For me." A slow sigh escaped him. At 39, Ethan had built one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country. Business magazines called him brilliant. Investors called him unstoppable. Yet none of those labels felt meaningful anymore. Not after the last 8 months. Not after the doctors began speaking in softer voices whenever his mother entered the room. A knock sounded at his office door. "Come in," Ethan said. His assistant, Margaret, stepped inside carrying a folder. "The London team confirmed the relocation timeline," she said carefully. "If you approve the final documents, operations can begin transferring next month." Ethan glanced at the folder without reaching for it. London, 6,000 miles away. A fresh start. New headquarters. New opportunities. Everyone thought it was the obvious next step. Everyone except him. Margaret hesitated. "You are still planning to attend tonight's dinner?" Ethan rubbed a hand across his jaw. "Apparently I am." The blind date. Her tone carried just enough amusement to make him smile faintly. "My mother has become very persistent." Margaret laughed softly. "Can you blame her?" Ethan looked away. His mother's determination had only intensified since her diagnosis. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same subject. Work less. Live more. Find someone. Build a family. Ethan understood why she wanted those things for him. The problem was that he had stopped believing they were possible. Years of carefully managed relationships had taught him one uncomfortable truth. Most people saw the company before they saw the man. They saw the wealth before they saw the person carrying it. Eventually, every conversation became transactional. Every connection felt conditional. "I will survive one dinner," Ethan said. Margaret smiled. "That is the spirit." After she left, silence settled across the office again. Ethan turned toward the window. His reflection stared back from the glass. Expensive suit. Perfect tie. Controlled expression. From the outside, his life looked complete. Inside, it felt increasingly hollow. His phone vibrated. This time it was Mercy Memorial Hospital. Ethan answered immediately. "Hello." "Good afternoon, Mr. Calloway," a nurse said warmly. "Your mother asked us to remind you that she expects you to keep your dinner plans tonight." Ethan closed his eyes. Even from a hospital room, she was orchestrating his personal life. She recruited the staff now. The nurse laughed. "She can be very persuasive. I noticed." "She had a good afternoon," the nurse added gently. "She wanted you to know that." Some of the tension left Ethan's shoulders. "Thank you." After ending the call, he remained still for several seconds. "Good afternoon." Those two words should not have carried so much weight. Yet lately they did. Because every good day felt precious. Every ordinary moment felt temporary. Across the desk sat a framed photograph taken 12 years earlier. Ethan picked it up. The picture showed a younger version of himself standing beside his mother outside a small suburban house. She was laughing at something he had said. Her eyes sparkled with the same warmth that had carried him through every difficult chapter of his life. She had worked double shifts as a school secretary after his father died. She had skipped vacations so he could attend college. She had sacrificed quietly and constantly without ever asking for recognition. And now time was asking for something back. Ethan set the photo down carefully. His gaze drifted toward the city again. Somewhere beyond those buildings, life continued for millions of people. Parents picked up children from school. Couples argued and made up. Families gathered for dinner. Ordinary moments. The kinds of moments Ethan had spent years postponing. His phone buzzed once more. A calendar reminder appeared on the screen. Blind date. 7 o'clock. Riverfront Grill. Ethan stared at it for several seconds before finally standing. He reached for his coat. He had no idea that by the following evening, a woman named Grace Bennett would say fewer than 50 words to him and somehow change the direction of his entire life. Across town, while Ethan was staring at the Chicago skyline from his office window, Grace Bennett was standing in the checkout line of a neighborhood grocery store, calculating whether she could stretch $43 through the rest of the week. The fluorescent lights overhead cast a pale glow across the worn tile floor as her 5-year-old son, Noah, sat in the shopping cart, humming quietly to himself. A box of cereal rested in his lap. "Can we get this one, Mom?" he asked hopefully. Grace glanced at the price tag and smiled apologetically. "Not today, buddy." Noah nodded without complaint and carefully returned the box to the shelf. Moments like that always broke her heart a little. Not because Noah was difficult. Quite the opposite. He was too understanding for a child his age. Too aware of what things cost. Too quick to say he did not need something whenever money became tight. After paying for groceries, Grace loaded the bags into her aging Honda Civic. The February wind swept through the parking lot, carrying the scent of snow. She buckled Noah into the back seat and climbed behind the wheel. Her phone buzzed before she could start the engine. The caller ID displayed the name of her friend Melissa. Grace answered immediately. "Hey, please tell me you are still free tomorrow night," Melissa said without greeting. Grace laughed. "That sounds suspicious. I need a favor." "There it is." Melissa groaned dramatically. "The woman I set up for a dinner tomorrow just canceled." Grace started the car. And I already promised my cousin I would find someone." "Melissa, hear me out." Grace already knew where this was going. "No, you have not even heard the details. Because every time you say those words, I end up regretting whatever happens next." Melissa ignored her. "It is one dinner. 1 hour. Nice restaurant. Free meal." Grace pulled onto the road. "You forgot the important part." "What?" "The blind date." "Technically, yes." Grace laughed again. "Absolutely not." She had not been on a date in nearly 6 years. Between hospital shifts, school pickups, grocery bills, and helping Noah with kindergarten homework, romance existed somewhere near the bottom of her priority list. Melissa lowered her voice. "Grace, when was the last time you did something for yourself?" Grace glanced in the rearview mirror. Noah was staring out the window at passing buildings. "I do things for myself. Buying coffee does not count." "It absolutely counts." "One dinner." Grace shook her head. "I cannot." "Why?" There were 100 reasons. Noah, work, exhaustion, life. But underneath all of them was another truth she rarely admitted. The last relationship had left scars that were not visible. Noah's father had walked away before his son was born. Since then, Grace had built a life based on certainty. She trusted schedules. She trusted hard work. She trusted herself. Blind dates belonged to another version of her life. "I am not interested," she said gently. Melissa sighed. "Fine. I tried." The conversation ended a few minutes later. Grace thought the subject was closed. It was not. The next afternoon, after finishing a 12-hour shift at the hospital, she arrived at Noah's daycare to discover Melissa waiting outside with a hopeful expression and a garment bag hanging from one arm. Grace immediately narrowed her eyes. "What did you do?" Melissa grinned. "I brought options." "Melissa, just listen." Grace folded her arms. "This should be good. The restaurant already has the reservation. My cousin is counting on me. You deserve one evening away from work. And before you say no, my mother volunteered to watch Noah." Grace blinked. "You arranged babysitting?" 3 hours ago. "You planned this." "Weeks ago." Grace stared at her friend in disbelief, while Noah happily ran toward them, holding a finger-painted picture from class. Melissa smiled triumphantly. "You are going." Grace looked down at her son, then at the garment bag, then back at Melissa. Somewhere deep inside, a tiny voice whispered that perhaps one harmless dinner could not hurt. What Grace did not know was that a simple decision she almost refused to make would place her across a table from a man whose life was about to collide with hers in the most unexpected way. The following evening, snowflakes drifted lazily across downtown Chicago as Grace stood in front of her bathroom mirror, wondering for the 10th time whether agreeing to this dinner had been a mistake. The navy blue dress Melissa had brought fit perfectly, though Grace suspected that was because her friend had planned everything far more carefully than she admitted. From the living room came the sound of cartoons and Noah's laughter. It instantly eased some of the nervousness twisting inside her stomach. A soft knock sounded on the bathroom door. "Mom," Noah asked, "can I come in?" Grace opened the door and smiled. "Of course." Noah looked up at her with wide eyes. "You look fancy." She laughed. "Fancy? Like the people in Christmas movies." Grace crouched down and brushed a strand of blonde hair from his forehead. "Thank you, buddy." Noah studied her face for a moment. "Are you nervous?" The question caught her off guard. "Maybe a little." "Why?" Grace considered the simplest answer. "Because sometimes new things feel scary." Noah thought about that seriously. "Like kindergarten?" "Exactly like kindergarten." He nodded confidently. "You were right about kindergarten." "I was." "You said it would be scary at first, and then okay later." Grace felt warmth spread through her chest. "Well, maybe tonight will be like that too." Noah wrapped his small arms around her neck. "You will be okay." Grace closed her eyes briefly and hugged him back. Sometimes she wondered who was taking care of whom. 40 minutes later, after saying goodbye and thanking Melissa's mother at least 3 times for babysitting, Grace drove toward the riverfront restaurant. The city lights reflected across the dark water as she searched for parking. Her hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. She had not done this in years. Not since before Noah was born. Not since life became a constant cycle of responsibilities and schedules. Meanwhile, several miles away, Ethan sat alone at a table near the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows. The hostess had already offered to refill his water twice. His untouched menu rested beside his phone. Every few minutes his eyes drifted toward the entrance. Not because he was excited. Mostly because he wanted the evening finished. Across the room, couples laughed over dinner. A family celebrated a birthday near the back wall. Ethan found himself wondering why ordinary happiness always looked so effortless when viewed from a distance. His phone vibrated. A message from his mother appeared on the screen. "Are you there?" Ethan smiled despite himself. "Yes." "Good. Behave yourself." "I always behave myself." "That is not what your college records suggest." Ethan shook his head, laughing quietly. The brief exchange eased some of the heaviness he had been carrying all week. Then the restaurant doors opened. Cold air swept briefly through the lobby as a woman stepped inside. Ethan barely glanced up at first. Then he noticed the hostess greeting her. He noticed her hesitant smile. The way she brushed a snowflake from her coat sleeve. The way she seemed more concerned about being late than making an entrance. She looked around the restaurant until her eyes landed on him. For a moment, neither moved. Grace recognized him immediately from the photo Melissa had shown her. He looked exactly as she expected. Successful, composed, impossibly confident. Yet something about his expression surprised her. Beneath the polished exterior, he looked tired. Not physically tired. Something deeper. As though he had been carrying an invisible weight for far too long. Ethan stood as she approached the table. "Grace." "Ethan, nice to meet you." "You too." They shook hands. The contact lasted only a second. Yet both noticed the same thing. There was nothing dramatic about the moment. No instant spark. No fairy tale music. Just two strangers sitting down across from one another. Neither of them had the slightest idea that within the next few minutes, everything they believed about their future was about to change. The first few minutes felt surprisingly easy. Their menus remained closed while conversation moved naturally between them. Grace talked about working at the hospital. Ethan mentioned growing up in Chicago. Neither volunteered more than necessary. Neither seemed interested in impressing the other. It was unfamiliar territory for Ethan. Most first dates felt like interviews disguised as conversations. This one felt different. The waiter arrived and took their orders. Once he left, Grace wrapped both hands around her water glass and smiled. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan nodded. "Of course." "What makes you happy?" The question caught him completely off guard. For a second, he thought he had misheard her. "Happy." Grace laughed softly. That is usually how the word is pronounced. Ethan found himself smiling despite his surprise. "I just did not expect that question. Most people do not." "What about you?" Grace shrugged. "I asked first." Ethan leaned back in his chair. Outside the window, snow continued drifting across the city lights. "I honestly do not know anymore," he admitted. Grace did not rush to fill the silence. She simply waited. The way a nurse might wait for a patient to finish speaking. The way someone waits when they genuinely want the answer. Ethan looked down briefly. "Work used to make me happy." "Used to. Now it mostly feels like responsibility." Grace nodded thoughtfully. "That sounds exhausting." Ethan laughed quietly. "It is." The answer slipped out before he could stop it. Strange. He rarely admitted things like that. Not to employees. Not to investors. Not even to most friends. Yet somehow it felt natural sitting across from her. "What about you?" he asked. Grace's smile immediately softened. "My son." Ethan noticed the change in her face. The warmth. The pride. "How old is he?" 5. "That is a fun age." "Most days." "Only most." Grace laughed. "Ask me again after he covers the living room in finger paint." Ethan laughed with her. For the first time that week, the sound felt genuine. Their meals arrived. The conversation continued. Grace told stories about Noah learning to ride a bicycle. Ethan shared a memory about his mother teaching him how to drive an old pickup truck when he was 16. Every topic somehow circled back to family. To people rather than achievements. To moments rather than accomplishments. Halfway through dinner, Ethan's phone vibrated. His eyes instinctively dropped toward the screen. Mercy Memorial Hospital. His chest tightened immediately. He picked up the phone, but hesitated. Grace noticed the change before he spoke a word. "You can answer it," she said. Ethan shook his head. "It can wait." The phone stopped ringing. A few minutes later it vibrated again. Another message. Again his attention shifted. Again concern crossed his face before he could hide it. Grace watched quietly. Ethan forced himself back into the conversation, but his responses grew shorter. Distracted. Distant. He hated that she could probably see it happening. Then his phone vibrated a third time. This time Grace glanced toward the screen and saw the hospital name illuminated briefly before the display darkened. She looked back at Ethan. The exhaustion she had noticed earlier suddenly made sense. The tension in his shoulders. The constant checking of messages. The way he seemed physically present but emotionally somewhere else. Someone you love is there, she said gently. Ethan looked up. What? The hospital. Grace's voice remained soft. Someone important is there. Ethan stared at her. My mother. The words emerged almost automatically. He had not intended to share that. Yet once spoken, they felt strangely relieving. Grace nodded. Is she okay? Ethan looked down at the table. Some days are better than others. That was all he said. It was enough. Grace understood immediately. Not the details. The feeling. The fear. The helplessness. She remembered sitting beside her father's hospital bed years earlier, wishing she could bargain with time itself. Suddenly, the elegant restaurant around them felt less important than the truth sitting quietly between them. And for the first time that evening, Grace realized this dinner was never the thing Ethan truly cared about. Grace lowered her eyes briefly before looking back at Ethan. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background, while something quieter settled between them. Understanding. Not because they shared the same life, but because they recognized the same fear. My father spent a long time in hospitals, Grace said softly. Ethan listened. When I was younger, I thought there would always be more time. Her fingers traced the edge of her water glass. More holidays, more conversations, more chances to say things that mattered. Ethan remained silent. Then one day the doctor started using phrases like, make memories and cherish the time you have left. A sad smile touched her lips. Nobody prepares you for how quickly ordinary moments become important. Ethan looked out the window toward the snowy Chicago streets below. Her words landed deeper than she realized. Over the past 8 months, he had postponed dozens of dinners with his mother, rescheduled visits, cut conversations short because meetings seemed urgent. There had always been another conference call, another acquisition, another problem requiring his attention, another reason to believe tomorrow would be available. My mother used to leave me handwritten notes in my lunchbox, he said quietly. Grace smiled. Really? Ethan nodded. Every day. What kind of notes? He laughed softly. Mostly reminders to be kind. Grace smiled wider. That sounds like something a good mother would write. She was. Ethan stopped himself. The past tense slipped out unintentionally. Grace noticed immediately. She still is. Ethan looked down. The simple correction tightened something in his chest. The waiter approached to clear their plates, but neither seemed interested in dessert. The conversation had moved somewhere neither expected. Somewhere more honest. Ethan's phone vibrated again. He glanced at the screen. Another update from the hospital. He opened the message this time. Stable evening. Resting comfortably. Relief washed over him so suddenly he almost laughed. Grace saw the change in his expression. Good news? She asked. Yes. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Thank goodness. Her response surprised him. There was no curiosity about details. No attempt to insert herself into the situation. Just genuine relief for another human being. They sat quietly for a moment. Then Grace glanced toward the time displayed on her phone. Ethan noticed her expression shift. Concern replaced calm. Everything okay? He asked. Yes. She hesitated. Mostly. Ethan waited. My babysitter is wonderful, she explained. But I promised Noah I would not stay out too late. The way she said her son's name carried the same warmth Ethan heard earlier. He is waiting up for you? Grace laughed softly. Almost certainly. Even on a school night? Especially on a school night. Ethan found himself smiling. You two seem close. It has been the two of us for a long time. There was no bitterness in her voice. No self-pity. Just simple truth. Ethan admired that. Many people carried hardship like a badge. Grace carried hers with quiet dignity. She checked the time again. Then she looked back at him. For a brief moment, Ethan thought she was about to say something important. Something she had been considering throughout the evening. Instead, she simply smiled. You know, she said gently. I think you should go see your mother tonight. Ethan blinked. What? Grace folded her hands together. I think you came here because someone you love asked you to. Ethan stared at her. And I think you spent most of this dinner wishing you knew how she was doing. The words were not critical. They were not judgmental. They were simply true. Grace stood and reached for her coat. Ethan watched in complete surprise. You are leaving? I think I should. Because of Noah? She smiled. Partly. Then her expression softened. But mostly because I think there is somewhere else you would rather be. The realization struck him instantly. She was right. Not because he disliked the evening. Quite the opposite. It was the most genuine conversation he had experienced in years. Yet deep down, part of him had been sitting beside a hospital bed all night. Grace slipped her coat over her shoulders and looked at him one final time. I think you should be with your mother tonight. For several seconds after Grace walked away, Ethan remained seated at the table staring toward the restaurant entrance. The chair across from him sat empty now, yet somehow her presence lingered. Around him, dinner conversations continued. Glasses clinked. Waiters moved between tables. Life carried on exactly as before. But something inside him felt different. He reached for the check, paid quickly, and stepped outside into the cold Chicago night. Snowflakes drifted through the glow of the streetlights as he stood on the sidewalk. His first instinct was to walk toward his car. Instead, he found himself looking down the block, wondering which direction Grace had gone. It made no sense. They had known each other less than an hour. Yet he could not stop replaying the conversation in his mind. Most people spent their time trying to impress him. Grace had spent hers reminding him what mattered. His phone vibrated again. This time he answered immediately. Hello, Mr. Calloway? It was the night nurse from Mercy Memorial. Your mother is awake and asking if you survived your date. Ethan laughed unexpectedly. That depends on your definition of survived. Would you like me to tell her you are coming? He looked toward the dark skyline. Yes. She will be happy. After ending the call, Ethan climbed into his car and headed toward the hospital. 25 minutes later, he stepped onto the cardiac floor carrying a paper cup of coffee. The familiar scent of antiseptic and fresh linens filled the hallway. Nurses smiled as he passed. By now they all knew him. Room 514 was partially lit when he entered. His mother looked up immediately from her bed. Well, she asked. Ethan laughed. Hello to you too. Do not avoid the question. Good evening, Mom. Ethan. Her expression remained determined. Something's illness had not changed. Ethan pulled a chair beside the bed. The dinner was nice. Nice? She repeated suspiciously. That is the word people use when they do not want to discuss details. Ethan looked down briefly before smiling. Her name is Grace. His mother noticed the smile instantly. Oh, do not start. I did not say anything. You were about to. Perhaps. She grinned. Ethan shook his head. She is a single mother. And nothing. Ethan. He sighed. She is kind. The room grew quiet. His mother studied him carefully. That sounds important. Ethan looked toward the window. Snow collected softly against the glass outside. I think it might be. His mother reached across the blanket and squeezed his hand. Tell me about her. For the next 20 minutes he did. He told her about Noah. About Grace working long shifts at the hospital. About the way she listened more than she talked. About how she seemed completely uninterested in titles or money. Most importantly, he told her about the moment Grace stood up from the table and reminded him where he truly wanted to be. His mother listened without interrupting. When he finally finished, she smiled softly. She sounds wonderful. Ethan looked down. Maybe. You want to see her again. It was not a question. Ethan hesitated. Then he nodded. The problem is I do not know how. His mother laughed quietly. For someone who runs a billion-dollar company, you can be remarkably helpless. Ethan rolled his eyes. Thank you for that encouragement. You know her name. Mom. You know where she works. Mom. And I assume you know at least one person responsible for arranging the date. Ethan stared at her. Slowly, a realization began forming. Across town, Grace was tucking Noah into bed while listening to him explain every detail of his kindergarten art project. She smiled, kissed his forehead, and turned off the bedroom light. What she did not know was that somewhere on the other side of the city, a man who had spent years planning mergers, acquisitions, and international expansions had just decided that finding her again was suddenly the most important project in his life. 3 days later, Ethan found himself standing in the lobby of St. Matthew's Medical Center, holding a paper bag from a bakery 2 blocks away. The situation felt strangely absurd. He had delivered presentations to international investors without hesitation. He had negotiated contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Yet walking into a hospital to see Grace again somehow made him nervous. The scent of coffee and antiseptic drifted through the lobby as nurses and visitors moved in every direction. Ethan checked the note Melissa had reluctantly provided after enduring 20 minutes of questions from him. Pediatric wing. 3rd floor. Grace Bennett. He stepped into the elevator before he could talk himself out of it. Upstairs, Grace was reviewing patient charts at the nurse's station when she heard a familiar voice. "I hope bribery is allowed here." She looked up. For a second, she thought she was imagining him. Ethan stood a few feet away holding the bakery bag with an expression that was equal parts confidence and uncertainty. Grace blinked. "What are you doing here?" "That depends." He lifted the bag slightly. "Do you like blueberry muffins?" A laugh escaped before she could stop it. Several nurses nearby immediately noticed. "You found me. I had help." Grace shook her head, already knowing Melissa was responsible. "Of course you did." Ethan handed her the bag. "Peace offering." "For what?" "Tracking you down." Grace looked at him for a moment before accepting it. "Thank you." For the next few minutes they spoke between her responsibilities. Nothing dramatic. Nothing life-changing. Just conversation. Yet Ethan found himself enjoying every second. Eventually, a small voice interrupted them. "Mom." Grace turned immediately. Noah stood near the hallway entrance holding the hand of an older volunteer. His kindergarten had dismissed early because of a teacher training event. The moment he spotted Grace, he smiled and ran toward her. Then he noticed Ethan. Noah stopped. "Who is that?" Grace smiled. "This is Ethan." Noah studied him carefully. Ethan suddenly felt as though he were being evaluated by the most important board member in America. "Hello, Noah." Noah nodded politely. "Hello." The volunteer excused herself and disappeared down the hallway. Grace crouched beside her son. "Remember the dinner I told you about?" Noah looked back at Ethan. "The fancy dinner?" "That one." Noah seemed satisfied with the explanation. He turned toward Ethan again. "Do you have kids?" Ethan smiled. "No." "Do you have a dog?" "Also no." Noah frowned thoughtfully. "That sounds lonely." Grace covered her mouth to hide a laugh. Ethan stared at the child before unexpectedly laughing himself. "Sometimes it is." Noah nodded as if that confirmed a serious suspicion. "We have a goldfish." "Really?" "His name is Captain Pancake." Ethan glanced at Grace. "That is an excellent name." "I know." Noah looked very proud of himself. A few minutes later, Grace was called away briefly to assist with a patient. Ethan remained beside Noah in the waiting area. They sat together near a large window overlooking the snowy parking lot. For a while, Noah focused on drawing rockets with crayons provided by the volunteer desk. Then, without warning, he asked a question. "Is your mom at work?" Ethan looked down at him. "No. She is at a hospital." Noah's crayon stopped moving. "Is she sick?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "A little." Noah thought quietly. Children had a way of processing difficult truths with remarkable simplicity. Finally, he looked up. "My grandpa got sick before he went to heaven." Ethan swallowed. "I am sorry." Noah nodded. Then he asked, "Is your mom still here?" "Yes." "Then you are lucky." Ethan stared at the small boy. Noah returned to his drawing, as if he had merely commented on the weather. But the words settled heavily in Ethan's chest. "Then you are lucky. Not rich. Not successful. Not powerful. Lucky. Because despite everything, he could still visit his mother. Still hear her voice. Still hold her hand." Through the window, snow continued falling across Chicago. Ethan blinked rapidly and looked away. For the second time in less than a week, someone from Grace Bennett's family had reminded him of something he should have understood long ago. Over the following weeks, Ethan's life began changing in ways that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. The London relocation project remained on his desk, but for the first time, he stopped treating it as an automatic decision. Instead of spending every evening in conference rooms and executive meetings, he found himself sitting beside his mother's hospital bed, listening to stories he had heard 100 times and somehow never appreciated enough. They talked about his childhood. They looked through old photographs. They laughed about mistakes that had once felt enormous and now seemed wonderfully small. One afternoon, his mother looked at him across the room and smiled. "You are different." Ethan glanced up from a photo album. "Different how?" "Present." The answer stayed with him long. After he left the hospital, she was right. For years he had lived as though life were always waiting somewhere in the future. The next promotion, the next deal, the next achievement. Grace and Noah had reminded him that life was happening now. A month later, Ethan invited Grace and Noah to a small neighborhood park on a Saturday afternoon. Snow had melted, replaced by the first signs of spring. Children raced across the playground, while families filled picnic tables nearby. Noah ran ahead toward the swings. "Watch this," he shouted. Ethan watched as the little boy launched himself into the air with complete confidence. Grace laughed beside him. "He has been practicing that all week." Ethan smiled. "I can tell." For a moment, they stood quietly together. Comfortable. No longer strangers. No longer pretending to be anything other than themselves. "I heard you postponed London," Grace said. Ethan nodded. "I did. Big decision. The biggest one I have made in years." Grace looked at him carefully. "Do you regret it?" Ethan followed Noah with his eyes as the boy raced toward the slide. Not for a second. Grace smiled. The answer seemed to make her happier than she expected. Later that afternoon, Noah climbed onto the bench beside Ethan holding a juice box. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Ethan laughed. "That usually means trouble." Noah grinned. "Maybe." He thought for a moment before asking, "Are you coming to my soccer game next Saturday?" Ethan blinked. The question was so simple, so natural, yet it touched something deep inside him. "If your mom says it is okay." Noah immediately turned toward Grace. "Can he come?" Grace laughed. "I think that is allowed." Noah looked back at Ethan. "Good." Then he returned to his juice box as though the matter had been officially settled. Ethan looked at Grace and shook his head. "He is surprisingly persuasive. You have no idea." They both laughed. Across the park, sunlight filtered through newly budding trees. Families gathered. Children played. Ordinary moments unfolded everywhere. The kind of moments Ethan once rushed past without noticing. Months later, when people asked what changed his life, they expected him to mention a business decision, a market breakthrough, or a career milestone. Instead, he always thought about a tired single mother who looked past his title and saw the worried son underneath. He thought about a 5-year-old boy who reminded him what true wealth looked like. And he thought about the lesson that arrived when he least expected it. Sometimes the most important people enter your life quietly. Not to rescue you, not to impress you, simply to remind you what matters before it is too late.